We in NATO and the EU have three stark choices. As the battle ebbs and flows between Benghazi and Tripoli, Misrata is under siege. On ITN, I saw a young lad whose spine had been severed horrifically by a mortar shell. This I've angered me greatly. These three stark choices that we have is to arm the rebels, to put mercenary forces in to combat Gaddafi, or to put ground forces in, regular British Army ground forces. Now, we can argue about the legal basis of putting mercenaries in, or whether we should arm the rebels. Niall Ferguson has said that we should not arm the rebels because those arms could fall into the hands of Islamic militants. That is a possibility, but I believe he's wrong to be so pessimistic about this, about the democratic changes in the Middle East, which started with one man setting himself alight in Tunisia for democratic reasons, and spread to Egypt, which got rid of Mubarak, and then is now challenging the Ba'athist regime in Saudi Arabia, the Yemen regime, and also the Ba'athist regime in Syria, the Yemeni regime, and also the feudalist crime family in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family, and the Bin Laden crime family. But should we arm the rebels? Is it even feasible? I believed at one time that we should arm the rebels, but I've changed my mind. On the basis of using mercenaries, Gaddafi is using mercenaries illegally to kill and maim his own people. He's using mercenaries from Niger, Chad and Congo and other Central African countries to inflict and impose his rule on them against their own will. Now, Libya's revolution may have more to do, as Niall Ferguson has argued, with the rising prices of food and fuel. But I believe that there is a true democratic revolution happening in Libya, and it has a lot to do with trying to get rid of the Gaddafi crime family, and less to do with a civil war. Libya is a very homogeneous country. It is basically dominated by Sufism, which is the more peaceful brand of Islamism, and Sunniism as well. Now, on reading the Daily Mail, not a paper that I'm particularly fond of, they said about the use of SAS and SBS men that's the Special Boat Service and the Special Air Service, to become mercenaries on extended leave in private mercenary companies, private military companies, such as Sandline and others, to act as forward air controllers for the rebels and to guide Allied aircraft in. Now, what seems to be driving towards the ground forces, either by mercenary forces or regular forces, is the fact that whilst the NATO can take out people from 15,000 feet, sometimes even the rebels by mistake, but they can take out tanks from 15,000 feet with JDAMs. They cannot take out mortar crews who have infiltrated into Misrata and who are killing the rebel and civilian forces of Misrata. Misrata is under heavy bombardment and heavy siege and heavy infiltration by Gaddafi forces, and so we must think about ways to stop this. Gaddafi is using people cynically as human shields in his own capital to prevent the Allies attacking him there, and so eventually we were going to get to the point where we're going to need to use ground forces. Now, why should we think that it's less legitimate? In the Daily Mail was trying to say that it's more legitimate to use private military companies than to use regular ground forces. This to me seems absurd. The mercenaries themselves know that if they're killed, there's an aspect of deniability by the British or French governments or EU governments or NATO of their involvement, and also their families will not be looked after as British regular forces would be. There's also the factor of cost, as we saw with Blackwater in in Iraq. Although I do believe Blackwater should be used by the Boers to get independence in South Africa and to prevent crime, I do not think that the use of Blackwater in or other private military companies in Libya would be conducive to the public relations, as well as much as anything else, of the West using private military mercenaries, which would put us on a moral par with Gaddafi. There's also perhaps the risk of more civilian casualties with more trigger-happy mercenaries than there would be with more cautious regular forces. Now, what we do have, and what I will argue for here, is the deployment of our heavy armour, which we are not using to the greatest extent in Afghanistan, whereas we could use it, and we can use assets such as the Typhoon fighter for ground attack and tornadoes in the ground attack role in Libya. Why is Libya important economically and strategically for the EU, as well as for our security, our energy security? Well, BP has invested billions of pounds in Libya, and also we get a lot of our oil from Libya and a lot of our oil reserve from Libya. So it is in the long-term interest of the EU to keep this country stable and to become a democratic part of the Middle Eastern Union with the EU as its secure market for its energy. What about the future of operations in the Middle East? We will need Libya's oil to prosecute a war against the Saudi Arabian and Bin Laden crime families, as America is prosecuting this war against them and does not have the ground forces to do this in Libya, as it's involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and is facing down Iran. Whereas the EU, Britain and France, has bases throughout Africa and can intervene, especially with the Swedish and French forces it has in Chad, which successfully defeated the Sudanese army there in 2008. Now, what about the criticism of NATO by the EU? Is NATO doing enough? Well, NATO claims it's doing 200 sorties a day against Libya, against Tripoli and Gaddafi's regime. But the EU believes that it should be doing more, and perhaps we should be thinking now of putting ground forces in. It was always going to get to the point where we're going to need the gun and the bayonet to do this. Now, be it with my short-term military experience, many people will be calling for this who've never served, but I believe it is necessary to stop the slaughter of the people of Misrata. Thank you for listening.